Laura Briden, it's such a pleasure to have you back on the show. I am so excited. When I saw your book come out on Insta, I was like, I need to reach out to her right now, yesterday, because I need to interview you about this book. This is the book I've been wanting to see out there in the world, and I am not surprised that you have written it, Metabolism Repair for Women. And so I want to just hear about I have a feeling it's very similar to my reason for wanting a book like this out into the world. But what was the impetus? What was the inspiration when you knew you're like, I need this book needs to be written?
Such a good question. It's so nice to chat with you again, Marissa. I'll just say we've had a few chats over the years. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, for me, it was about going deeper into women's health. I think I know that you know a lot about metabolic health yourself. Like it's such a deep part of our health. It influences everything else. It definitely influences mental health. There's a lot of talk about that right now, metabolic psychiatry, which is exciting, changing people's lives. In metabolic health or cellular health or mitochondrial health, or how the body is using fuel also affects female health, menstruation and perimenopause and all the symptoms that go along with that in a very big way. And also in the other direction, female hormones, metabolic health. So there's this bidirectional relationship, which I wanted to explore in the book. And also I just knew from 25 years with patients that as important as metabolic health is, it often just kind of falls off the radar for people. And obviously, my book and lots of other books like it are trying to change that conversation and bring what's called insulin resistance sort of more into focus for people. I know insulin resistance sounds quite complicated, and a lot of people think, oh, that must not apply to me, but it does. It affects, probably depending on who you ask, it probably affects close to 1 in 2 people. So it's a big problem. It affects day-to-day life. It affects day-to-day energy and hunger levels and obviously weight gain, but also long-term effects like how well you can navigate perimenopause and what is your risk of heart disease and dementia. Yeah, it's big.
Yeah, I would say insulin resistance is probably the biggest risk factor for heart disease, which is the number one killer in women. Well, it's everybody, but more women than men, at least in the US.
Yeah, it's not a small thing.
No, I'm so grateful you started with talking about insulin resistance, and again, that our cellular energy, our metabolic health it runs everything, how we feel, how we think, what we do. It powers everything in our body. And insulin resistance is one of those silent kind of risk factors that ultimately can lead to a lot of symptoms. When I talk a lot about metabolic health, I always want women to kind of have a sense of, well, how do I even know? If we have 1 in 3 children here in the US with insulin resistance, you can imagine there's a lot of adults struggling with it as well. And we see an uptick, particularly for women in midlife. And so how do you go about assessing metabolic syndrome or metabolic dysfunction in your practice? And even in the book, what are some of the ways that we can begin to assess that? And how early on do you feel we should be doing it?
Yeah, good question. Well, I dedicate all of chapter 5 to assessment of it. There are lots of little clues that people can find, even on just their basic blood work. I mean, there are some specific tests that I'll touch on today. I won't go too much in detail, but and as to how early it should be done, I mean, I think if any of these signs or symptoms are showing up at any age, I think it's time to assess. As we know, probably the group of younger women who are most in the territory of insulin resistance are women with PCOS. They often they're a group who do often know about insulin resistance. So, but that can, be happening in teen years or 20s. As you pointed out, insulin resistance does tend to worsen not only with age, but there's a big shift with perimenopause, menopause transition. But in terms of assessment, one thing just to say right off the bat is that a normal blood glucose reading or even a normal HbA1c cannot rule out insulin resistance. So this is very crucial. The main feature with insulin resistance is chronically elevated insulin, the hormone insulin. And glucose is kind of all over the place to start with. In fact, it's very common. One of the symptoms of insulin resistance is reactive hypoglycemia, which I do point out because this all started, well, not all started, but a few months ago, I had a comment on social media of a woman saying, oh, well, I must not have insulin resistance because I get low blood sugar. And, she was thinking that insulin resistance is associated with high blood sugar, which it is eventually. But in the early years, it can present a lot of times with low blood sugar. So that's really crucial, I think, for people to understand. The other signs would be high cholesterol on blood tests. Insulin resistance is not the only explanation for high cholesterol, but it's a common one. Specifically high triglycerides, which is something people keep their eye on. In fact, some scientists think a combination of high triglycerides and low HDL, which is the the good cholesterol, is one of the best surrogate markers for biomarkers for insulin resistance. High CRP is another thing people might see on their blood results. Not to get too technical, but one more thing is high ALT. That's in the biochemistry or liver function part of blood tests. That's associated with fatty liver.
Mm-hmm.
And also anyone who's been told they have fatty liver or might have fatty liver based on a blood test or an ultrasound, that is usually insulin resistance. There are other explanations for it, of course, but if those other explanations have been ruled out, then it's almost always metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance. There's an epidemic of fatty liver right now. So some people listening almost certainly would have been mentioned to them. And then, of course, there's the weight gain specifically around the middle. And this is around visceral fat. And I do like to try to clarify this for people. This is not the kind of jiggly, soft fat you can see with, that you can pinch or that creates rolls on the tummy. That's not belly fat or visceral fat. I mean, that's still subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is inside. It's quite hard. And it feels like, my patients describe it as like this kind of hard shelf under their rib cage. They know it's not right. They're like, oh, that doesn't feel good. That doesn't feel normal. And that's what's called hypertrophied or enlarged visceral fat. And that becomes when that happens, and it's reversible, it's entirely reversible, that becomes almost like its own endocrine or hormonal organ. It starts promoting all these weird signals, talking to the brain. And one of the other main symptoms of insulin resistance and hypertrophied visceral fat is just feeling hungry all the time, which is quite important because if the main symptom is feeling hungry all the time, it's pretty difficult to reverse that by just using willpower to try to eat less. There are better strategies for reversing it.
Mm-hmm. I love that you talked about the ratio of triglycerides to HDL. A lot of my women that I work with who come to me initially with their labs, kind of their basic, primary care annual lab panel, fasting glucose is there, their comprehensive metabolic panel is there, and their standard lipid cholesterol panel, but not a fasting insulin. No. And so what I end up doing is I show them how to look at that triglyceride to HDL ratio.
That's great. So that aligns with you. Yeah. So right. So fasting insulin, it's good to mention that. So yeah, depending on the doctor and the clinician. So I have been for decades ordering fasting insulin. So again, this is for everyone listening, this is measuring the hormone insulin as opposed to just glucose. And fasting insulin can pick up insulin resistance. In the book, I talk about some ways that it can sometimes miss it. So it's one test among many. You want to sort of put it in the whole picture and see if it fits. Basically if fasting insulin is elevated, so I guess, I don't know, in the US if you use international units or picomoles, but
international. I know you have and everyone kind of lands different. I say 6 or above is when I start to say an indication of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
I know for you, I look at maybe 8 and above.
I went with 8. Yeah. So but the reference ranges on the labs will all be
25.
I know. Sometimes they say 25, which is, no one thinks that. No scientists think, if you've got a fasting insulin up around 25, that is 100% insulin resistance. Yeah. Basically, if it's high, if it's elevated above 8 or 10 or 6, maybe depending on who you talk to, that's insulin resistance. But if it's low, you don't necessarily know. I guess what I'd say is a low fasting insulin doesn't necessarily rule it out, depending on other factors. It's mainly because insulin tends to, for one thing, it fluctuates on a, every 90 minutes or something. And it comes down quite quickly. Mm-hmm. So if you've even fasted for more than the 12 hours, or if someone's already been on a lower carb diet or doing a lot of exercise in the days leading up to the test, it will already have come down. And then the other factor is the test itself, insulin, is quite unstable in pathology samples. So depending on the lab, if they haven't handled it properly, if they haven't frozen the blood sample immediately after sampling it, then insulin can be kind of falsely low. But as a rule of thumb, if it's high, it's insulin resistance. If it's low, you don't know necessarily based on that.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, labs are a great indicator. And obviously I look at other biometrics too, like hip to waist ratio, or even just, what the measurement of your waist is, blood pressure. And then, I really like to talk about the subtle symptoms of metabolic dysfunction that feel like the everyday pain points that can start to, again, this is a silent, kind of condition that can blossom into some really big chronic issues down the road. And so I'm looking at low energy and brain fog, menstrual cycle irregularities, again, something like if we're looking at kind of early indications of polycystic ovarian syndrome, cravings, as you mentioned, crazy mood swings, hunger, throughout the day, especially if it's consistent. Like for me, it used to be, I remember I had to have had insulin resistance in my 20s. And at 2:00 on the dot every day, I needed to have something sugary to get me through the rest of the day. And looking back, I was like, oh my gosh, I thought it was stress. And I'm sure it was part of it a little bit. I'm sure it was a yes. And I'm like, but it was definitely blood sugar and insulin deregulation. I was having reactive hypoglycemia from lunch, most likely. And I would love to speak into reactive hypoglycemia, because I remember growing up and I heard so much about people had low blood sugar, and not to say that that isn't possible, but I hear that a lot when I was growing up. And I hear that now today. And my first kind of my gut indication is like, oh, are we dealing with reactive hypoglycemia, where that's actually indicative of insulin resistance, not that you have consistent low blood sugar?
Yeah. Well, so reactive insulin resistance, as you just described, it happens usually within 4 to 5 hours of a meal. And so what happens is, because insulin resistance is associated with this like chronically elevated insulin or potentially higher levels of insulin, and insulin pushes blood sugar down. So you get this like really strong pushing down of blood sugar that the other hormones that are supposed to be keeping blood sugar up are not able to sort of overcome. So you get this crash in blood sugar. It can be very distressing, actually. It can be, I had one patient, and I shared the patient story in this book, is, she would feel like she was dying. She almost thought she was having almost like panic attacks, until she realized it was low blood sugar. Of course, there are other drivers of low blood sugar, and I've actually just put together.
That's why I wanted to distinguish between. I love that this is a nuanced conversation, because there absolutely is other drivers of low blood sugar that isn't insulin resistance or early stage insulin resistance.
Yeah. So, and I actually have got probably by the time this podcast is out, I'm releasing a short, just 15-minute podcast of me explaining all the different causes of low blood sugar, especially in young women. And so a lot of it's to do with the autonomic nervous system, and women have quite a different autonomic nervous system, which is like the parasympathetic sympathetic balance compared to men. And young women in particular, associated with the nervous system, seem to have what they call a blunted glucagon response. This is how the scientists describe it. So glucagon is the hormone that's supposed to be kind of working against insulin and keeping blood sugar high. And so for different reasons, women can have that. But I guess one takeaway is that it's not normal to feel hungry all the time, or to have that kind of panicked hunger. And I know from working with my patients that a lot of people do, and it makes sense, right? If you've been like that for years, you think, well, this is just must be how I am. Like I get super, super hungry. So then imagine how difficult it is, like from that perspective, then, them being told by the just eat less, messaging or mantra, that's very difficult for them to sort of imagine being able to do. They're like, well, I must have to withstand this horrible feeling of hunger and this panicked feeling of low blood sugar. I must have to be able to withstand that with willpower. And the reality is that's not possible. And women shouldn't be asked to do that. And they certainly shouldn't be feeling ashamed because they can't, withstand that crashing blood sugar hunger feeling. So another way of doing things, an alternative, is obviously that I present in my book, and I'm sure you've spoken to lots of other experts about, is to not try to withstand it from willpower at all, but to go further upstream and to stabilize the system, and in some cases, reverse insulin resistance, improve metabolic flexibility, so the body always has the energy it needs, even between meals. It should be pretty easy and cruisy to go 4 or 5 hours between meals. I mean, that should not be a difficult thing to do if all the parts of metabolism are working correctly. So the reward for improving insulin sensitivity or reversing insulin resistance is having more energy and feeling less hungry.
Yeah. I want to pivot a little bit to, what does good metabolic health look like? And
Yeah,
I
I
think you
know.
kind of just defined a little bit of that.
Yeah.
One, that we have energy throughout the day, that we can switch substrates to burn fuel
Yes.
for energy,
Yeah.
and just feel a bit easy breezy. Like we're not
Yeah.
struggling to get through the day with these crazy cravings and hunger pangs and mood swings and brain fog and all that.
Exactly. Well, our default, this is about the energy we're using for fuel, pretty much whether it's kind of glucose or fat. It's always a mix. We're a mix of fuels. This is how the human organism works. But our healthy default is actually to be in fat burning, kind of majority fat burning when we're kind of at rest and just going about our day and gentle activity, maybe walking. And then what's supposed to happen is then we sort of move more into glucose burning when we're exerting ourselves or, running or, this is part of the stress
Exercising,
response too.
hit training, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. That's when all your cells, including your muscle cells, need that, glucose for this higher intensity. But with insulin resistance and what's called metabolic inflexibility, people sort of get locked into more glucose burning all the time. Never exclusively. There's always going to be some fat burning, but they're kind of more locked into this other mode of glucose burning. And the problem is we don't have nearly as much glucose in the system as we have fat. We have, I mean, we could walk hundreds of miles on the fat supply that a normal person has, even without being overweight. That's one of the purposes of our body fat is to provide this steady, slow burn of energy. And so if people are locked into glucose burning, then of course, when that runs out, the glucose from their last meal or even their glycogen stores start to, go down quickly. The brain will be like, no, we need to have some more glucose coming in. And that's, part of the drive to eat is this drive for not just the taste of sugar, but like sugar cravings are sometimes just people just feel like they need it to survive, actually, like to get through the day.
Absolutely. Well, and then once it becomes so resistant, then our cells can't even take it in. And so it becomes this bigger compounding issue where even though our bodies want to be only burning glucose, we can't burn it.
It's a very difficult place to be because you feel both exhausted and hungry all the time. And I do want to say for everyone listening, this is reversible and quickly. I mean, this is a very important part of physiology that is also quite dynamic and can improve. And a lot of those changes can happen quite quickly within a few weeks, usually, even before, for example, people might see their weight changing on the scale. So my argument with the book, my position is pursuing better metabolic health. The first rewards are going to be better energy, zest, as I call it in the book, better ongoing satiety, which is feeling like you have enough energy. And that'll happen even before you see, changes on the scale or changes in how clothes fit. And I hope that by making the initial goals just feeling a lot better in terms of energy, people will, find it easier to sort of keep going and, avoid that problem of thinking, oh, I've tried this diet and the scale's going up and down. So, that must not be working. And then, giving up. And I understand that's, a lot of people have been in that position. It is hard to make long-term changes to diet sometimes.
It is hard. And I really do appreciate that. Was one of the things I really loved about the book was the stance around how are we improving metabolic flexibility, energy, brain function, cardiometabolic health, that's what we really want to be addressing. And I get how society has painted us against ourselves around our weight. And, that's a very complex and nuanced conversation, but it's very much how I talk about it as well. It's like, how do we improve our metabolic health? And most importantly, how do we improve our health span? Because that's what I would really love. How do we ensure that we can get up off the toilet and we can put our luggage in the overhead compartment? How do we have
Yeah.
energy for these things? How do we have energy as we're older for chasing our grandkids around? Like these are the goals and kind of what I want women to be measuring. Also their labs too. We obviously want to get them out of the zone of prediabetes or whatever that may be. But yeah, those are those type of kind of indicators or benchmarks I would love to see over measuring body composition or weight on the scale over time.
Yeah, maybe we should dive into a little bit into just, as you say, it's a tricky topic, but just some of the, the shame around body size and all the emotional baggage of the last however many decades of sort of women being told they need to look a certain way. And as you're saying, that's not really what this is about. And fortunately, as we've said, the change in body shape is going to be downstream from all the other, beneficial, having more energy, having
let's go there. One of the things we were talking about before we started this interview, with the conversations we often hear, I cannot tell you how often I'm starting to work with somebody and they're just like, I'm not lazy. I'm really trying. They just really want me to know that, that although they feel like it's their fault, that they don't want me to think that they are not productively trying to fix this problem. That's something I hear all the time. They just want me to know it's not for a lack of trying. 100%. And that breaks my heart because I have been that woman so many times.
I hear the same thing from my patients. Yeah, there is, this because the narrative has been, well, just to frame it again, the narrative has been, okay, well, you just, it must just be that you ate too much or didn't move your body enough. And then that led to fat gain, and then that led to metabolic dysfunction. And what you and I are talking about today, and what my book talks about, is flipping that whole thing, acknowledging that metabolic dysfunction is coming first, primarily from pretty significant changes in the food environment and plus environmental toxins. That is why it's affected so many people. So it's not just that people are suddenly, compared to 50 years ago, have lower willpower or anything like that. That's just not possible. So the metabolic dysfunction comes first, and then it increases hunger and decreases energy expenditure. And then an outcome, a symptom of all of that can be increased body size. And so recognizing, the change in body size as a symptom rather than a cause, I think hopefully can help to dispel some of that shame. In fact, chapter 1 of my book is called Weight Gain is Not Your Fault, or Metabolic Dysfunction is Not Your Fault. It's quite sad, actually, that what's happened society-wide in terms of our food supply. It's not just the food that those of us in this generation or younger generations are eating currently, but it's the food we had as children through no one's fault. It's just the food that was provided at the supermarkets. And then not only that, but there is an intergenerational trend. Scientists are tracking. They do know that something called epigenetics is affecting a lot of this. So if your listeners have heard that before, it just means genes being switched on and off from the environment, including the food environment, and then passed on to the next generation. And so this is why the problem of metabolic dysfunction, insulin resistance, eventually sort of weight gain is being passed on and amplified from generation to generation. This is why kids now are being at such a risk. As you had, hadn't heard that stat before about
1 in 3.
Did you say 1 in 3
of children 12 to 18 years old have are pre-diabetic?
Yeah, have it right. So not just insulin resistance, but sort of moving more into the pre-diabetic. And so this is interesting because that was not the case 40 or 50 years ago. And to be fair, hands up, as a young person, as a teenager myself, my diet was not great. Like, it wasn't terrible. Like, there were some good things at home that were happening, but I was definitely eating,
no, my diet was not great.
No cookies
or as a
and
child,
drinks and
I was eating McDonald's at like 2 years old or something awful like that. And we just didn't, we just didn't know. We didn't know how detrimental it was going to be. 40 years ago, we weren't really seeing it play out. I mean, when we went to school, there was maybe one child that I knew in many years of schooling that had, type 1 diabetes or had,
Yes.
or who was a
Which
little
is
bit
very different.
overweight. It was
Yeah.
just very different. It just didn't exist. Now, one of my dearest friends, Dr. Elisa Song, was just on the show, and, 1 in 5 children by the time they're 18 years old will have a chronic condition. And
Wow.
how did we get here? And you nailed it on the head. It's the ultra processed food. It's the toxins that we're exposed to. And it upticks. We start to see a decline in hormones. We see an uptick in metabolic issues as well for women. But we absolutely cannot blame women, or women should not blame themselves at all if we're seeing this play out in our children and grandchildren right now at almost the same rate. And so it's very much the food that's being consumed and the environment that we're living in.
Yeah, and because of this amplification generation by generation, children are being born. Basically, what that means is children are being born much, much more vulnerable to insulin resistance than they were a couple of generations ago. They're basically being born that way because of things that happened to their grandparents potentially, and then their parents. So this is why they, even in the same, our junk food environment that I was eating 40, 50, 45 years ago, my generation wasn't experiencing the same degree of metabolic damage from the same food supply, because we just our epigenetics were different. That's part of why, the messaging that it's not people's fault. It also is quite a sobering thing of society-wide. And just to acknowledge, most scientists that I've read or talked to see this as a society-wide problem. It's shifting it from it's all on the individual to, try to overcome this. And we need to think about this bigger picture and change the food supply in some big ways. So hopefully that's going to be happening. But at the same time, people for whom have been victim to this, then it's also important to acknowledge it's never too late. There's still ways to try to turn this around.
I agree. And I want to talk about those. As I mentioned before, there have been a couple times in my life where I knew I was definitely dealing with insulin resistance and then reversed it. And so the last time was in my mid 30s, I want to say, and reversed it along with my thyroid issue before getting pregnant, and then have really maintained it ever since. And so, and it's it's the level of it, I will say, there is something to be said about the intentionality of keeping yourself in good metabolic health. But that you absolutely can reverse it. My household is a metabolic loving household. Everything it's so, there's a lot of hacks and lifestyle strategies, and we make almost everything from scratch to help to not only maintain the adults in the house, their metabolic health, but obviously our little 3.5-year-old. Given the alarming stats of children growing up today, I feel a deep, deep sense of responsibility to my child to keep him with a good metabolic standing, and keeping his inflammation down, all of it. And so it is very much the focal point of our lives here in my house.
So you mentioned one. So in my book, I do break it down into metabolic obstacles. There's about 25 actually, but that I talk about with, and most people I think are going to identify, I predict, 4 or 5 that kind of apply to them, that are maybe the big ticket items that they've got to focus on in their particular situation. But one is near the top. I think it might be the number one, or no, maybe it's below kind of stress and circadian rhythm, but near the top of this list is cooking at home, which you just mentioned. And I know that's challenging.
It's hard.
It is hard. And I also share in the book, and I'll share it with you now, I really don't like cooking. Like, I really do not like it, which again, that's not the best role model, but I share it because I just want people to know that I don't like cooking at all. And I still do it. In fact, I've been doing it more this year because my husband's gone back to university in his 50s, which is quite interesting. And so I've been like running the kitchen, and which is new for me because 20 years of marriage, and I usually cooked about 1 in 5 meals, and now I'm doing most of them. So it's always possible. And
my husband too. My husband is the main chef, I'm the sous chef, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But I am the mama too. So I'm the meal prepper. I am the breakfast prepper. I am the lunch prepper. I do all if we're baking, I'm baking everything from scratch. And so, but it's a massive commitment. And that means we start cooking. Our nanny leaves at 4:30. One of us is in the kitchen at 4:30. Like it is a chunk of our time. And I know that it's an obstacle for people. It's one of those things that I don't want to call it a sacrifice by any means, but it's definitely an opportunity cost. There's other things that we are not doing because we are cooking.
Yeah. And it can, I mean, there are different levels of investment. I think it can be done. I mean, one of my messages in the book is
it can be
just
done.
keep it simple.
Cooking, you can get creative.
Throw something in the air fryer, or like just throw something in the oven, and put something as long as you've got amazing. Some protein and some vegetables, and get something on the tables. Hopefully, for anyone listening who possibly a lot of your listeners already do cook, and that might not be one of their metabolic obstacles. The advantages of cooking is, of course, that you can control the ingredients, and you can have fresh ingredients, you can have good quality protein, and you can have good quality oils. I did want to touch on that. I know you know quite a lot about this, but there has been sort of controversy last few years about vegetable oil and seed oil. And I'll just say I'm in the camp where I do think it's pretty important to try to shelter from vegetable oils. And unfortunately, and seed oils. Yeah. So seed oils being, I guess the differentiation is, vegetable oils is the broader term, but vegetable can include fruit oils like olive and avocado, and those are fine. But all the soy and corn and
the rapeseed, even maybe grapeseed or safflower, all of those kind of oxidized oils. Do your best. And I feel like my audience is very much on par with.
They already know about that. Yeah. Okay. So that's already been covered. Yeah.
Controversy. Why even, why land on the side of like, it doesn't matter. I think it's one thing to be cooking with those things. I think where it gets really dicey is restaurants that are cooking with it. So it's something to consider, takeout. But also I know a lot of my audience listening to this are hopefully scrutinizing over ingredient lists, and it's mind blowing. And even the organic foods, the really healthy, snacks out there have seed oils in them. A lot of them do, and hence, when I remember having a big conversation with my husband about a year and a half ago, and I was like, I've been through this. I've been through the store. I've read all the ingredients and the labels, and I'm not willing to cut any kind of corners anymore. I'm just not doing it. And so I was like, that means we have to take this all in house. And I knew I needed buy-in, because that meant a lot more cooking. And I was like, but if our son is everything to, this is just where we landed. If the metabolic health of our child is everything, what are we willing to do? And I was like, we're not buying this anymore, or we're not letting this sneak in anymore. Like, it's just a no-go. So, because it's so sneaky in so much of our products that we don't realize.
It's true. And the reason it's used in everything is because it's the cheap oil, right? So food producers loved this when there was this shift to, have vegetable oil. It's like, oh, great, we can do that and also make a much bigger profit because it's way cheaper than using, butter or coconut oil. So I'm probably not as strict as you, just also for listeners. I mean,
I'm pretty strict, and my audience knows.
They know. Okay, so so I do still eat in restaurants, and unlike you were saying some of your local restaurants have no seed oil signs. Mine do not. So I'm pretty confident.
There's 4 restaurants just within a 10-minute walk from our home that are either complete celiac friendly facilities and dairy-free ingredients. Wow. 4 of our restaurants are no seed oil allowed in their cooking process. Right. So that honestly, it's insane that we have 4 restaurants on our block.
That's right. So it's not like that where I live. So I do have to, I guess I'm finding a middle ground. I don't eat out that often, but if I have to eat out, if I'm busy, if it's a work lunch or something, or I'm out, then I just roll with it. But try to, when I'm cooking mostly at home and using either butter, coconut oil. Sometimes we use like duck fat if we cooked a duck, or getting a little fancy. So that and those are tastier oils anyway. So that's just, and I guess my philosophy is we can do this most of the time. We use olive oil as well. If we can use this most of the time at home, then I'm hopeful that the little bit that we get out in restaurants is not going to be as big a problem. And you can still obviously say, don't use commercial prepared salad dressings. It's in all, the vegetable oils and all the prepared foods.
Absolutely. And so I'm so grateful we touched on that too.
Yeah.
And I know people are like, okay, cooking at home. Okay. And I think it's important that we just keep hearing this. We just keep, what are some of the other, two of the bigger obstacles you said? Stress, which amen, I get it. And then 2, circadian rhythm disruption, which, let's be honest, there's nothing about this life that we live that is conducive to good circadian rhythm.
It's so funny. It was so funny researching for this book and looking at all, like, as you can,
everything.
There's so much science going on. Like, there's so many scientists doing little deep dives into whatever their aspect is. And reading the papers, it's so fun to see, like, whatever their thing is, whether it's environmental toxins or circadian disruption or microbiome is another big one. They're prepared to say, look, this explains everything. This is the thing. And so, of course, I think it is a combination of things. So I think that just makes sense. Yes, circadian disruption really does seem to affect metabolic health. And it's because every part of the body has a body clock. And one thing that's really bad for circadian health is if the body clocks, for example, the liver clock or the microbiome clock gets out of sync with the central brain clock. So if your brain's going, hey, it's nighttime, but your like liver and gut are like, oh, well, a bunch of food just came in.
We just had a late night snack.
It must be daytime. It must be daytime. So there's this like, wait, what? What time is it? And like, that seems to really throw out the sort of regulatory mechanisms that are supposed to be in charge of everything we just talked about, like insulin sensitivity and being able to burn fat for energy and all of that. That's why I find, is trying to align circadian rhythm is a very easy. It's one of for every metabolic obstacle, I assigned it importance and level of difficulty. So it's, easy or sort of high or low priority, and then easy or difficult. And so for circadian alignment, I would put that high priority and easy. So, get some morning light, get outside in the morning if possible, eat protein by 10 a.m. I would say is part of it. And also probably ideally stop eating by like 8 p.m. And then it helps.
You are more flexible than me, Laura.
What times would you give for that?
I usually say I'd love to have people finishing dinner by 7, women, but 6:30, I've put enough CGMs on people to just see our level of insulin resistance and its impact. And I've also looked at labs of so many women who late night eating happens and the unfavorable lipids and insulin resistance. And so if I can get people to end in dinner a little on the earlier side, especially kind of along with their circadian rhythm, and then starting, I love protein by 10 or 9 a.m. That's kind of where I land. But I do find I can really nip that insulin resistance for some women if we can even roll back eating time.
That's an easy thing in the evening, unless they're really getting blood sugar crashes, in which case I would say take a few steps back, put in place some things just to get blood sugar, stop it from crashing, and then try that gentle overnight fasting again. One thing I would say about protein in the morning, and just again, your listeners sound like they probably know a lot of this already, but big hit of protein. I had a patient say to me the other day, it's like, oh, I had a chia pudding for protein. I'm like, what
is that? Like, maybe 10 grams? What are we talking about here?
It was 4 grams of protein. Okay, so 4 grams of protein is, not, obviously she was trying, like she knew she needed protein, like, but actually protein looks like 30 grams. So that's going to be either some meat, which is kind of my favorite. Like I'm a leftover meat for breakfast kind of person.
It's because we don't like to cook.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Or, you can do eggs, but you're going to have to layer them with something else because one egg is only like 6 or 7 grams.
Yeah.
7 grams of protein. So you're going to have eggs plus salmon.
I want that muscle protein synthesis. I want that kickoff. I want that. I want to punt that bad boy into the goal line. So I agree. And muscle mass, a loss of muscle mass, sarcopenia, dynapenia. Like I'm not trying to get women to be frail by the time, they're in their mid 60s. So
totally. I had one patient when I finally talked her into having like meat for breakfast, and she'd been having this one patient I'm thinking of, she'd been having lots of blood sugar crashes. And then she finally committed to like having leftover chicken or something in the morning. And she's like, well, that almost feels like it's cheating. Like suddenly, like her sugar crashes just disappeared. She's like, that was too easy. Like anyone can avoid sugar if you have a big hit of protein in the morning. I'm like, that's the case for a lot of people. And the other thing to bring into this conversation is chronotype. I am pretty interested in
Mm.
individual variability in body size, like body shape, which is also interesting. We didn't really talk about that in the shame part of our conversation, but some women just have bigger bums than other women. There's quite a bit of variability in terms of normal body shape, especially for women. But there's also quite a bit of individual, there's up to about 3 or 4 hours of normal variation in circadian rhythms. So there's also outside of that. So if people are really skewed into being a night owl, that can be not healthy. That can actually be that their body clock is out of sync and they're like existing in kind of a permanent jet lag state. Even for a very healthy person, people, some individuals are going to be more morning people and some are more evening people. And so this is where a lot of the debate comes into, breakfast and what time to have breakfast. I'm like, well, people really do need, some people are raring to go at 7 a.m. and need that big 30 grams of protein at 7. And some people can't face it at that time. And that could be, again, that could be maybe something with their digestion that's not right. There could be reasons for that, but it could just be they just need a bit of a later start and get all their hormones and their digestive juices flowing, and then they'll be ready to eat. So I think that's why there does need to, for at least for my patients, I try to work with them. It's like, what time in the morning are you actually hungry? Because
it's definitely nuanced. I think I'm not lending, especially as women head into midlife and muscle becomes so critical, their metabolic health becomes so critical. Yes. Waiting until noon or 2 p.m. to eat. Oh no. That's where I get concerned. So you land in the morning. If it's by 10 a.m., awesome. Yeah. If it's by 7 a.m., amazing. Wherever you are, I love the gentle fast. I love. The 12-hour, the circadian fast, again, with an earlier dinner time, I find that just is so helpful. And then you are hungry in the morning. You want that protein. And I love that she was eating chia seeds. That's great for fiber, chia and the chicken, getting both, I think is so important. But that way we're really preserving our muscle, or at least hopefully maintaining what we have as it gets to be more challenging to keep it. And so that's kind of where I land when it comes to like fasting and that protein intake. I also at night, I want women to eat a sufficient amount of protein so that they're not experiencing those crazy crashes and cravings. Nothing's worse trying to not eat until the morning and you had a big old bowl of pasta, and refined carbs. And by 10 o'clock, you're about to eat through your pantry,
Exactly, because of reactive hypoglycemia, what we talked about earlier. Yeah, for sure. And I'm all with you on muscle. I think maintaining muscle is one of the simplest anti-aging things we can do. Muscle is an endocrine organ. It's a hormonal organ. So it's talking to the brain. Muscle, even having more muscle can help with long-term satiety, which is that feeling of, having enough energy.
I love that. What was another big aha metabolic disruptor? I know before we wrap up, because I want everyone to go get the book, but was there another one? Because definitely stress, circadian rhythm, lack of movement has been a big one. Eating at home, those have been big ones for me.
Well, I'll touch on a couple. Alcohol, I would say is a metabolic disruptor. Alcohol be a big one. So we'll just let that, we won't expand on that. We won't expand on that. Certain medications, so certain types of hormonal birth control do promote insulin resistance. Unfortunately, I go into quite a bit of detail on that in the women's hormone section. But I will, let's finish with microbiome, because there's a lot.
How much you went into the microbiome in this book. I was actually surprised in a beautiful, pleasant, beautiful way. I was like, whoa, this is awesome. Like there's so much microbiome research in here and recommendations. I feel like I feel like people are like, okay, we're treating the gut. We're doing gut health over here, but they don't always connect the dots between our metabolic health and our gut health. Like you said, a lot of times these things are in silos, and it's just weird to me.
Two things about the microbiome then, I guess. One is that the bugs, the gut bugs or the gut bacteria are talking to the brain, like directly. They're basically sending signals up the vagus nerve to the brain, and they're rewarding the brain for the food they want. They're in some ways directing and deciding what food they'd like you to have. And there's this quote from a microbiologist saying, if gut microbes are controlling the brain, they're controlling everything. Like it's this really disconcerting feeling of like, okay, am I in charge? Who's in charge here? Like who really wants this like sugary snack? It's actually
our tummy friends here in my house. They're called tummy friends.
And
And
you can
some tummy
reach,
friends want sugar,
they do. And they want what they're used to having.
yeah, they want
So,
what
and
they're used to having, or
they
those particular
protest when
bacteria are overgrowing.
they protest when you stop giving them what they want. And so that can be part of the cravings too. So you have to, but unfortunately they don't stick around. Like if you deprive, like if you change your food within a couple of weeks, you've got a whole new set of bacteria who want the healthy foods. You kind of have to wait for them to kick in. But the other thing about the gut, and I actually, through my naturopathic doctor lens, I think this is a huge part of what's been going on, is SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. People might have heard about that on your podcast before. This is, an overgrowth of seeming, maybe even supposedly healthy gut bacteria species, but in the wrong place. They're up in the small intestine where they're not supposed to be. And that's quite inflammatory. And that can lead to what's called intestinal permeability. And that can directly lead to insulin resistance. I mean, there's like a direct connect the dots, because intestinal permeability increases hypertrophy or enlargement of visceral fat. It potentially, contributes to fatty liver, creating what's called, not to be too technical, but it's creating metabolic endotoxemia. So these like bacterial toxins in the body that impairs insulin sensitivity. So one of the interesting things when I look at, and I do talk about a lower carb diet a bit in the book, and there's a section about that. I think one of the benefits sometimes of reducing carbohydrates, especially refined carbohydrates, is that it's a treatment for SIBO. Basically, it's working on insulin and lots of other things, but it's actually also just directly working on the gut. So I guess the takeaway would be anyone who has SIBO or thinks they might have it or knows they have it, that's one of your main metabolic obstacle. That's one of your top 4 or 5. So you, in addition to circadian rhythm and getting enough protein and the things we've been talking about, you need to find a way to reverse that. And SIBO is always treatable. I provide 10 patient stories in the book. It was only later when I was kind of editing it and looking at it, I realized that 2 of the 10 are gut stories. So 2 of the 10 are fixed digestion, and then the person, drops 3 kilos or, 10 pounds or whatever, just without almost doing anything else. They just find, one of the patient's stories describes, we fixed her gut problem. And then she's like, oh, and I stopped craving sugar, just like that. That can happen. Yeah.
No, it is. I've had such great experience with that myself in treating SIBO or just dysbiosis. Things aren't just off, and how much that contributes not only to inflammation, blood sugar, insulin resistance, all of it.
Yep.
And if we can address that, it's multifaceted. It's never just the one thing, but that could be one of the bigger pieces that we unlock, and all of a sudden, everything kind of falls into place. The other thing I look at a lot too, and I know that you see this as well, especially women in midlife, as we're closing up. And I'm so grateful that you touch upon it. I just want to let everyone know that you do touch upon it, is thyroid and thyroid function. And so I was so grateful to see how much information was on there and recommendations around that, especially from a functional perspective. And so I just wanted to mention, if women are thinking and suspecting, you do such a great job of providing how to have conversations with your doctor, how to navigate the thyroid journey.
Yeah, because underactive thyroid, or even just being positive for thyroid antibodies or the Hashimoto's antibodies, the research shows does impair insulin sensitivity, increase the risk of fatty liver, all the things we've been talking about. So that's another important metabolic obstacle if that applies to them.
Mm-hmm. And then obviously declining hormones. We know that that's playing a role too.
Well, perimenopause, there's no question that estrogen plays a role. Yeah. Estrogen is kind of like a metabolic superpower that we have during our reproductive years. It shelters us through several mechanisms from insulin resistance. Not entirely. Obviously, it's still possible to have insulin resistance as a woman of reproductive age. But there's the scientists call it the metabolic upheaval of perimenopause, menopause, but again, there's always things you can do.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's always things you can mitigate. And I just love that this is really geared to women. Obviously, there's a lot of things that you can take to the bank for your partners as well in this book. There's so much in all of it. But I just love that there is a metabolic book for women by an amazing woman, by an amazing doctor. Lara, honey, I know that you have a little gift. I think it's the first 2 chapters of the book. So that'll be in the show notes to go and grab if you want just a little taste of what the book is about. But then it is available. It is available. I have the copy. It's phenomenal. It is, you're absolutely right. It's very compassionate. It's extremely science-based. And there are so many powerful recommendations to move the needle for you. So I don't want you to ever feel alone. This book has so much of the resources that you are looking for to navigate this. And I love that Libby Weaver and Stacey Sims are on the cover with their quotes. I love that.
They were very kind to give me an endorsement. And actually, I'm just realizing, Mariza, you're wearing this, your shirt is the same color as my book.
It is.
Your top.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'll take a picture today.
Yeah. So you're exactly the same color. It looks great. So metabolism repair
today. I love and I love the cover. It's so beautiful. You know, I love the color. I'm glad that that's the color you went with. It's, I love the poppy orange yellow. It looks like sunshine.
The day I announced the book or did the cover reveal, I went for my morning walk to get my morning light, and the sky was that color. So I just thought that was really lovely. It was like an orange, kind of red sky.
Feels like, you know, I think about this, like being in sunlight and that sunshine energy. It just feels energizing. And I feel like that's exactly what you were going for. So it was such a pleasure to have you on today. Thank you. And congratulations on the book. And thank you so much for writing it. I'm just so grateful we have something out there in the world just like this. Thank you.
Thanks so much.